Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. And once again, I'm joined by a little bit of a sunset behind me and a little bit of lag in my video. I apologize. It's very hard to keep enough space on this computer going for things to run smoothly. It is still going strong, this computer, but probably on its last legs. So I'm going to finish up this extremely long, but I hope interesting reading of Losing Earth. This is definitely a novella. People keep saying thank you for reading this book. It's almost a book, feels like book length. And pardon me, but I think I just lost my place. Excuse me. We're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. We had just finished, I guess, chapter 4 in part 2, and we're going to pick up on chapter 5. You will see things that you shall believe, summer 1988. It was the hottest and driest summer in history. Everywhere you looked, something was bursting into flames. 2 million acres in Alaska incinerated, and dozens of major fires scored the West. Yellowstone National Park lost 4 million acres. Smoke was visible from Chicago, 1,600 miles away. In Nebraska, suffering its worst drought since the Dust Bowl, there were days when every weather station registered temperatures above 100 degrees. The director of the Kansas Department of Health and Environment warned that the drought might be the dawning of a climate change that within a half century could turn the state into a desert. The dang heat, said a farmer in Grinnell. Farming has so many perils, but climate is 99% of it. In parts of Wisconsin, where Governor Tommy Thompson banned fireworks and smoking cigarettes outdoors, the Fox and Wisconsin rivers evaporated completely. At that point, said an official from the Department of Natural Resources, we must just sit back and watch the fish die. Howard University, for the first time, closed because of heat. New York City's streets melted. Its mosquito population quadrupled, and its murder rate reached a record high. It's a chore to walk, just to walk, a former hostage negotiator told a reporter. You want to be left alone. The 28th floor of Los Angeles' second tallest building burst into flames. The cause, the fire department concluded, was spontaneous combustion. Ducks fled the continental United States in search of wetlands, many ending up in Alaska, swelling the pintail population there to 1.5 million from 100,000. How do you spell relief? Asked a spokesman for the Fish and Wildlife Service. If you are a duck from America's parched prairies, this year you may spell it A-L-A-S-K-A. 19 Miss Indiana contestants outfitted with raincoats and umbrellas sang "Come Rain or Come Shine," but it did not rain. Reverend Jesse Jackson, Democratic presidential candidate, stood in an Illinois cornfield and prayed for rain, but it did not rain. Cliff Doble, the owner of a gardening store in Clyde, Ohio, paid $2,000 to import Leonard Crow Dog, Leonard Crow Dog, a Sioux Indian medicine man from Rosebud, South Dakota. Crow Dog claimed to have performed 127 rain dances, all successful. You will see things that you shall believe, he told the townspeople of Clyde. You will feel there is a chance for us all. After 3 days of dancing, it rained less than a quarter of an inch. Texas farmers fed their cattle cactus. Stretches of the Mississippi River flowed at less than 1/5 of normal capacity. Roughly 1,700 barges beached at Greenville, Mississippi. An additional 2,000 were marooned at St. Louis and Memphis. The on-field thermometer at Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, where the Phillies were hosting the Chicago Cubs for a matinee, read 130 degrees. During a pitching change, every player, coach, and umpire, save the catcher and entering reliever, Todd Froworth, fled into the dugouts. Froworth would earn the victory. In the Cleveland suburb of Lakewood on June 21st, yet another record smasher, a roofer working with 600-degree tar, exclaimed, "Will this madness ever end?" On June 22nd in Washington, where it hit 100 degrees, Rafe Pomerantz received a call from Jim Hansen, who was scheduled to testify the following morning at a Senate hearing called by Timothy Worth. "I hope we have good media coverage tomorrow," Hansen said. This amused Pomerantz. He was the one who tended to worry about press. Hansen usually claimed indifference to such vulgar considerations. "Why is that?" Pomerantz asked. Hansen had just received the most recent global temperature data. Just over halfway into the year, 1988 was setting records. Already, it had nearly clinched the hottest year in history. Ahead of schedule, the signal was emerging from the noise. "I'm going to make a pretty strong statement," Hansen said. 6. The signal has emerged, June 1988. The night before the hearing, Hansen flew to Washington to give himself enough time to prepare his oral testimony in his hotel room. But he couldn't focus. The ball game was on the radio. The slumping Yankees, who had fallen behind the Tigers for first place, were trying to avoid a sweep in Detroit, and the game went to extra innings. Hansen fell asleep without finishing his statement. He awoke to bright sunlight, high humidity, choking heat. It was signal weather in Washington, the hottest June 23rd in history. Before going to the Capitol, he attended a meeting at NASA headquarters. One of his early champions at the agency, Ishtiaq Rasool, was announcing the creation of a new carbon dioxide program. Hansen, sitting in a room with dozens of scientists, continued to scribble his testimony under the table, barely listening. But he heard Rasool say that the goal of the new program was to determine when a warming signal might emerge. "As you all know," Rasool said, "no respectable scientist would say that you already have a signal." Hansen interrupted. "I don't know if he's respectable or not," he said, "but I do know one scientist who is about to tell the U.S. Senate that the signal has emerged." The other scientists looked up in surprise, but Rasool ignored Hansen and continued his presentation. Hansen returned to his testimony. He wrote, "The global warming is now large enough that we can ascribe with a high degree of confidence a cause and effect relationship to the greenhouse effect." He wrote, "1988 so far is so much warmer than 1987 that barring a remarkable and improbable cooling, 1988 will be the warmest year on record." He wrote, "The greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now." By 2:10 p.m., when the session began, it was 98 degrees and not much cooler in room 366 of the Dirksen Senate office building, thanks to the 2 rows of television camera lights. Timothy Worth's office had told reporters that the plain-spoken NASA scientist was going to make a major statement. After the staff members saw the cameras, even those senators who hadn't planned to attend appeared at the dais, hastily reviewing the remarks the aides had drafted for them. Half an hour before the hearing, Worth pulled Hansen aside. He wanted to change the order of speakers, placing Hansen first. The senator wanted to make sure that Hansen's statement got the proper amount of attention. Hansen agreed. "We have only one planet," Senator Bennett Johnson intoned. "If we screw it up, we have no place to go." Senator Max Baucus, a Democrat from Montana, called for the United Nations Environment Program to begin preparing a global remedy to the carbon dioxide problem. Senator Dale Bumpers, a Democrat of Arkansas, previewed Hansen's testimony, saying that it ought to be cause for headlines in every newspaper in America tomorrow morning. The coverage, Bumpers emphasized, was a necessary precursor to policy. Nobody wants to take on any of the industries that produce the things that we throw up into the atmosphere, he said. But what you have are all these competing interests pitted against our very survival. Worth asked those standing in the gallery to claim the few remaining seats available. "There is no point in standing up through this on a hot day," he said, happy for the occasion to emphasize the historical heat. Then he introduced the star witness. Hansen, wiping his brow, spoke without effect, his eyes rarely rising from his notes. He spoke without affect, his eyes rarely rising from his notes. The warming trend could be detected with 99% confidence, he said. It is changing our climate now. But he saved his strongest comment for after the hearing when he was encircled in the hallway by reporters. It is time to stop waffling so much, he said, and say that the evidence is pretty strong that the greenhouse effect is here. The press followed Bumper's advice. Hansen's testimony prompted headlines in dozens of newspapers across the country, including the New York Times, which announced across the top of its front page, "Global warming has begun. Expert tells Senate." But Hansen had no time to dwell on any of this. As soon as he got home to New York, Aniek told him she had breast cancer. She had found out 2 weeks earlier, but she didn't want to upset him before the hearing. In the following days, while the entire world tried to learn about James Hansen, he tried to learn about Aniek's illness. After he absorbed the initial shock and made a truce with the fear, his grandmother died from the disease. He dedicated himself to his wife's treatment with all the rigor of his profession. As they weighed treatment options and analyzed medical data, Aniek noticed him begin to change. The frustration of the last year began to fall away. It yielded, in those doctors' offices, to a steady coolness, an obsession for detail, a dogged optimism. He began to look like himself again. 7. Woodstock for climate change, June 1988 to April 1989. In the immediate flush of optimism after the Worth hearing, henceforth known as the Hansen hearing, Rafe Pomerantz called his allies on Capitol Hill. The young staff members who advised politicians, organized hearings, wrote legislation. "We need to finalize a number," he told them, a specific target in order to move the issue, to turn all this publicity into policy. The Montreal Protocol had called for a 50% reduction in CFC emissions by 1998. What was the right target for carbon emissions? It wasn't enough to exhort nations to do better. That kind of talk might sound noble, but it didn't change investments or laws. They needed a hard goal, something ambitious but reasonable, and they needed it soon. Just 4 days after Hansen's star turn, politicians from 46 nations and more than 300 scientists would convene in Toronto at the World Conference on the Changing Atmosphere, an event described by Philip Shabakoff of the New York Times as Woodstock for climate change. Pomerantz hastily arranged a meeting with, among others, David Harwood, the architect of Worth's climate legislation, Roger Dower in the Congressional Budget Office, who was calculating the plausibility of a national carbon tax, and Irving Mincer, a colleague at the World Resources Institute who had a deep knowledge of energy economics. Worth was scheduled to give the keynote address at Toronto. Harwood would write it and could propose a number then. But which one? Pomerantz had a proposal, a 20% reduction in carbon emissions by 2000. Ambitious, Harwood said. In all his work planning climate policy, he had seen no assurance that such a steep drop in emissions was possible. Then again, 2000 was more than a decade off, so it allowed for some flexibility. What really mattered wasn't the number itself, Dower said, but simply that they settle on one. He agreed that a hard target was the only way to push the issue forward. Though his job at the CBO required him to come up with precise estimates of speculative, complex policy, there wasn't time for yet another academic study to arrive at the exact right number. Pomerantz's unscientific suggestion sounded fine to him. Mincer pointed out that a 20% reduction was consistent with the academic literature on energy efficiency. Various studies over the years had shown that you could improve efficiency in most energy systems by roughly 20% if you adopted best practices. Of course, with any target, you had to take into account the fact that the developing world would inevitably consume much larger quantities of fossil fuels by 2000. But those gains could be offset by a wider propagation of the renewable technologies already at hand: solar, wind, geothermal. It was not a rigorous scientific analysis, Mincer granted, but 20% sounded plausible. We wouldn't need to solve cold fusion or ask Congress to repeal the law of gravity. It's very interesting that they brought up cold fusion in this. But that's a whole nother story. We could manage it with the knowledge and technology we already had. Besides, Pomerantz said, 20 by 2000 sounds good. In Toronto a few days later, Pomerantz talked up his idea with everyone he met. Environmental ministers, scientists, journalists, nobody thought it sounded crazy. He took that as an encouraging sign. Other delegates soon proposed the number to him independently, as if they had come up with it themselves. That was an even better sign. Worth, in his keynote on June 27th, called for the world to reduce emissions by 20% by 2000, with an eventual reduction of 50%. Other speakers likened the ramifications of climate change to a global nuclear war, but it was the emissions target that was heard in Washington, London, Berlin, and Moscow. The conference's final statement, signed by all 400 scientists and politicians in attendance, repeated the demand with a slight variation: a 20% reduction in carbon emissions by 2005. Just like that, Pomerantz's best guess became global diplomatic policy. Hansen, emerging from Aniak's successful cancer surgery, took it upon himself to start a one-man public information campaign. He gave news conferences and was quoted in seemingly every article about the issue. He even appeared on television with homemade props. Like an entrant at the elementary school science fair, he made loaded dice out of sections of cardboard and colored paper to illustrate the increased likelihood of hotter weather in a warmer climate. Public awareness of the greenhouse effect reached a new high of 68%. At the end of the sulfurous summer, several months after Gore ended his candidacy, global warming became a major subject of the presidential campaign. While Michael Dukakis proposed tax incentives to encourage domestic oil production and boasted that coal could satisfy the nation's energy needs for the next 3 centuries, George Bush took advantage. "I am an environmentalist," he declared. "I am an environmentalist." I can't do a good George H.W. voice, but whatever. He declared on the shore of Lake Erie, the first stop on a 5-state environmental tour that would take him to Boston Harbor, Dukakis's home turf. "Those who think we are powerless to do anything about the greenhouse effect," he said, "are forgetting about the White House effect." His running mate emphasized the ticket's commitment to the issue at the vice presidential debate. "The greenhouse effect is an important environmental issue," Dan Quayle said. "We need to get on with it. And in a George Bush administration, you can bet that we will." Amazing that the Republicans were way more on top of this issue and way more willing to do anything about it during this whole time. Amazing. The kind of talk roused the oil and gas men. A lot of people on the Hill see the greenhouse effect as the issue of the 1990s, a gas lobbyist told Oil and Gas Journal. Before a meeting of oil executives shortly after the environmentalist candidate won the election, Representative Dick Cheney, a Wyoming Republican, warned it's going to be very difficult to fend off some kind of gasoline tax. The coal industry, which had the most to lose from restrictions on carbon emissions, had moved beyond denial to resignation. A spokesman for the National Coal Association acknowledged that the greenhouse effect was no longer an emerging issue, but was here already, and we'll be hearing more and more about it. By the end of the year, 32 climate bills had been introduced in Congress, led by Worth's omnibus National Energy Policy Act of 1988. Co-sponsored by 13 Democrats and 5 Republicans, it established as a national goal an international global agreement on the atmosphere by 1992, ordered the Energy Department to submit to Congress a plan to reduce energy use by at least 2% a year through 2005, and directed the Congressional Budget Office to calculate the feasibility of a carbon tax. A lawyer for the Senate Energy Committee told an industry journal that lawmakers were frightened by the issue and predicted that Congress would eventually pass significant legislation after Bush took office. The other great powers refused to wait. The German parliament created a special commission on climate change, which concluded that action had to be taken immediately, irrespective of any need for further research, and that the Toronto goal was inadequate. It recommended a 30% reduction of carbon emissions. The prime ministers of Canada and Norway called for a binding international treaty on the atmosphere. Sweden's parliament went further, announcing a national strategy to stabilize emissions at the 1988 level and eventually imposing a carbon tax. And Margaret Thatcher, who had studied chemistry at Oxford, warned in a speech to the Royal Society that global warming could greatly exceed the capacity of our natural habitat to cope, and that the health of the economy and the health of our environment are totally dependent upon each other. Amazing. It was at this time, at a moment when the environmental movement was, in the words of one energy lobbyist, on a tear, that the United Nations unanimously endorsed the establishment by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Program of an intergovernmental panel on climate change composed of scientists and policymakers to conduct scientific assessments and develop a global climate policy. One of the IPCC's first sessions to plan an international treaty was hosted by the State Department 10 years after Bush's inauguration. James Baker chose the occasion to make his first speech as Secretary of State. We can probably not afford to wait until all the uncertainties about global climate change have been resolved, he said. Time will not make the problem go away. Much of Congress agreed. On April 14th, 1989, a bipartisan group of 24 senators, led by the majority leader, George Mitchell, requested that Bush cut emissions in the United States even before the IPCC's working group made its recommendation. We cannot afford the long lead times associated with a comprehensive global agreement, the senators wrote. Bush had promised to combat the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. The self-proclaimed environmentalist was now seated in the Oval Office. It was time. 8. You never beat the White House, April 1989. After Jim Baker gave his boisterous address to the IPCC working group at the State Department, he received a visit from John Sununu, Bush's chief of staff. Leave the science to the scientists, Sununu told Baker. Stay clear of this greenhouse effect nonsense. You don't know what you're talking about. Baker, who had served as Reagan's chief of staff, didn't speak about the subject again. He later told the White House that he was recusing himself from the energy policy issues on account of his previous career as a Houston oil and gas lawyer. Sununu, an enthusiastic contrarian, delighted in defying any lazy characterizations of himself. His father was a Lebanese exporter from Boston, and his mother was a Salvadorian of Greek ancestry. He was born in Havana. In his 3 terms as governor of New Hampshire, he had come in the epithets of national political columnists to embody Yankee conservatism. Pragmatic, business-friendly, technocratic, no nonsense. He had fought angrily against local environmentalists to open a nuclear power plant, but he had also signed the nation's first acid rain legislation and lobbied Reagan directly for a reduction of sulfur dioxide pollution by 50%, the target sought by the Audubon Society. He was perceived as more conservative than the president, a budget hawk who had turned a $44 million state deficit into a surplus without raising taxes, and openly insulted Republican politicians and the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce when they drifted, however tentatively, from his anti-tax doctrinarianism. Yet he increased spending on mental health care and public land preservation in New Hampshire, and in the White House, he would help negotiate a tax increase and secure the Supreme Court nomination of David Souter. Bush had chosen Sununu for his political instincts. He was credited with having won Bush the New Hampshire primary, after Bush came in 3rd in Iowa, all but securing him the nomination. But despite his reputation as a political wolf, he still thought of himself as a scientist, an old engineer, as he was fond of putting it, having earned a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT decades earlier. He lacked the reflexive deference that so many of his political generation reserved for the class of elite government scientists. Since World War II, he believed conspiratorial forces had used the imprimatur of scientific knowledge to advance an anti-growth doctrine. He reserved particular disdain for Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which prophesied that hundreds of millions of people would starve to death if the world took no step to curb population growth. The Club of Rome, an organization of European scientists, heads of state, and economists, which similarly warned that the world would run out of natural resources, and as recently as the mid-70s, the hypothesis advanced by some of the nation's most celebrated scientists, including Carl Sagan, Stephen Schneider, and Ikhtiaq Rasool, that a new ice age was dawning thanks to the proliferation of man-made aerosols. All were theories of questionable scientific merit, portending vast authoritarian remedies to halt economic progress. Sununu had suspected that the greenhouse effect belonged to this nefarious cabal since 1975. When the anthropologist Margaret Mead convened a symposium on the subject at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, unless the peoples of the world can begin to understand the immense and long-term consequences of what appear to be small, immediate choices, Mead wrote, the whole planet may become endangered. Her conclusions were stark, immediate, and absent the caveats that hobbled the scientific literature. Or as Sununu saw it, she showed her hand. Never before have the governing bodies of the world been faced with decisions so far-reaching, Mead wrote. It is inevitable that there will be a clash between those concerned with immediate problems and those who concern themselves with long-term consequences. When Mead talked about far-reaching decisions and long-term consequences, Sununu heard the marching of jackboots. In April, the director of the OMB, Richard Darman, a close ally of Sununu's, mentioned that the NASA scientist James Hansen, who had forced the issue of global warming onto the national agenda the previous summer, was going to testify again, this time at a hearing called by Al Gore. Darman had the testimony and described it. Sununu was appalled. Hansen's language seemed extreme, based on scientific arguments that he considered, as he later put it, like technical garbage. While Sununu and Darman received Hansen's statements, the EPA administrator, William K. Riley, took a new proposal to the White House. The next meeting of the IPCC's working group was scheduled for Geneva the following month, in May. It was the perfect occasion, Riley argued, to take a stronger stand on climate change. Bush should demand a global treaty to reduce carbon emissions. Sununu disagreed. It would be foolish, he said, to let the nation stumble into a binding agreement on questionable scientific merits, especially as it would compel some unknown quantity of economic pain. They went back and forth. Riley didn't want to cede leadership on the issue to the European powers. After all, the first high-level diplomatic meeting on climate change, to which Riley was invited, would take place just a few months later in the Netherlands. Statements of caution would make the environmental president look like a hypocrite and hurt the United States' leverage in negotiation. But Sununu wouldn't budge. He ordered the American delegates not to make any commitment in Geneva. Very soon after that, someone leaked the exchange to the press. Sununu, blaming Riley, was furious. When accounts of his argument with Riley appeared in the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post ahead of the Geneva IPCC meeting, they made the White House look as if it didn't know what it was doing. The deputy of Jim Baker pulled Riley aside. He said he had a message from Baker, who had observed Riley's infighting with Sununu. In the long run, the deputy warned Riley, you never beat the White House. 9. A form of science fraud. May 1989. In the first week of May 1989, when Hansen received his proposed testimony back from the OMB, it was disfigured by deletions and more incredible additions. Gore had called the hearing to increase the pressure on Bush to sign major climate legislation. Hansen had wanted to use the occasion to clarify one major point, that in the hubbub following the 1988 hearing had been misunderstood. Global warming would not only cause more heat waves and droughts like those of the previous summer, but would also lead to more extreme rain events. This was crucial. He didn't want the public to conclude the next time there was a mild summer that global warming wasn't real. But the edited text was a mess. For a couple of days, Hansen played along, accepting the more innocuous edits, but he couldn't accept some of the howlers proposed by the OMB. With the hearing only 2 days away, he gave up. He told NASA's congressional liaison to stop fighting. Let the White House have its way, he said. But Hansen would have his way too. As soon as he hung up, he drafted a letter to Gore. He explained that the OMB wanted him to demote his own scientific findings to estimates from models that were evolving and unreliable. His anonymous censor wanted him to say that the causes of global warming were scientifically unknown and might be attributable to natural processes. Oh my God. And it's still going on. Caveats that would not only render his testimony meaningless, but make him sound like a moron. Indeed. The most bizarre addition, however, was a statement of a different kind. He was asked to argue that Congress should only pass climate legislation that immediately benefited the economy, independent of concerns about an increasing greenhouse effect, a sentence that no scientist would ever utter unless perhaps he were employed by the American Petroleum Institute. Hansen faxed his letter to Gore and left the office. When he arrived home, Aniak told him Gore had called. Would it be all right, Gore asked, when Hansen spoke with him if I tell a couple of reporters about this? The New York Times' Philip Shabakov called the next morning. I should be allowed to say what is my scientific position, Hansen told him. I can understand changing policy, but not science. On Monday, May 8th, the morning of the hearing, he left early for his flight to Washington and did not see the newspaper until he arrived at Dirksen, where Gore showed it to him. The front page headline read, "Scientist says budget office altered his testimony." They agreed that Hansen should give his testimony as planned, after which Gore would ask about the passages the OMB had rewritten. Gore stopped at the door. "We better go separately," he said. "Otherwise, they'll be able to get both of us with one hand grenade." In the crowded hearing room, the cameras fixed on Hansen. He held a statement in one hand and a single Christmas tree bulb in the other, a prop to help him explain, however shakily, that the warming had already created by fossil fuel combustion was equivalent to placing a Christmas light over every square meter of Earth's surface. After Hansen read his sanitized testimony, Gore pounced. He was puzzled by the inconsistencies in the distinguished scientist's presentation. He said in a tone thick with mock confusion, "Why do you directly contradict yourself?" Hansen explained that he had not written those contradictory statements. "The Bush administration is acting as if it is scared of the truth," Gore said. "If they forced you to change a scientific conclusion, it is a form of science fraud." Another government scientist testifying at the hearing, Jerry Malman from NOAA, or NOAA, acknowledged that the White House had previously tried to change his conclusions too. Malman had managed to deflect the worst of it, however. "Objectionable and also unscientific recommendations," he said, "that would have been severely embarrassing to me in the face of my scientific colleagues." Gore called it an outrage of the first order of magnitude. The 1988 hearing had created a hero of Jim Hansen. Now Gore had a real villain, one far more treacherous than Fred Kumanoff, a nameless censor in the White House, hiding behind OMB letterhead. The cameras followed Hansen and Gore into a marbled hallway. Hansen insisted that he wanted to focus on the science. Gore focused on the politics. "I think they're scared of the truth," he said. "They're scared that Hansen and the other scientists are right and that some dramatic policy changes are going to be needed, and they don't want to face up to it." 10. The White House Effect. Fall, 1989. The censorship did more to publicize Hansen's testimony and the dangers of global warming than anything he could have possibly said. At the White House briefing later that morning, Press Secretary Marlin Fitzwater admitted that Hansen's statement had been changed. He blamed an official, 5 levels down from the top, and promised that there would be no retaliation. Hansen, he added, was an outstanding and distinguished scientist and was doing a great job. The Los Angeles Times called the censorship an outrageous assault. The Chicago Tribune said it was the beginning of a Cold War on global warming, and the New York Times warned that the White House's heavy-handed intervention sends the signal that Washington wants to go slow on addressing the greenhouse problem. The day after the hearing, Gore received an unannounced visit from the OMB director, Richard Darman. He came alone, without aides. He said he wanted to apologize to Gore in person. He was sorry, and he wanted Gore to know it. The OMB would not try to censor anyone again. Gore, stunned, thanked Darman. Something about his apology, the effusiveness, the mortified tone, or perhaps the fact that he had come by himself, as if in secret, left Gore with the impression that the idea to censor Hansen didn't come from someone 5 levels down from the top or even below Darman. It had come from someone above Darman. Darman went to see Sununu. He didn't like being accused of censoring scientists. They needed to issue some kind of a response. Sununu called Riley to ask if he had any ideas. "We could start," Riley said, "by recommitting to a global climate treaty. The United States was the only Western nation on record as opposing negotiations." Sununu sent a telegram to Geneva endorsing a plan to develop full international consensus on necessary steps to prepare for a formal treaty negotiating process. The scope and importance of this issue are so great that it is essential for the U.S. to exercise leadership. He proposed an international workshop to improve the accuracy of the science and calculate economic costs of emissions reductions. Sununu signed the telegram himself. A day later, the president pledged to host a climate workshop at the White House. Rafe Pomerantz was unconvinced, telling the press that this belated effort to save face was a waffle that fell short of real action. "We should be able to complete a treaty by the end of 1990, he said, not be starting one. But the general response from the press was relief and praise. Still, Sununu seethed at any mention of the subject. He had taken it upon himself to study more deeply the greenhouse effect. He would have a rudimentary, one-dimensional general circulation model installed on his personal desktop computer. He decided that the models promoted by Jim Hansen were a lot of bunk. They were horribly imprecise in scale and underestimated the ocean's ability to mitigate warming. Sununu complained about Hansen to D. Allen Bromley, a nuclear physicist from Yale, who, at Sununu's recommendation, was named Bush's science advisor. Hansen's findings were technical poppycock that didn't begin to justify such wild-eyed pronouncements that the greenhouse effect is here, or that the 1988 heat waves could be attributed to global warming, let alone serve as the basis for national economic policy. When a junior staff member in the Energy Department, in a meeting at the White House with Sununu and Riley, mentioned an initiative to reduce fossil fuel use, Sununu interrupted her. "Why in the world would you need to reduce fossil fuel use?" he asked. "Because of climate change," the young woman replied. "I don't want anyone in this administration without a scientific background using climate change or global warming ever again," he said. "If you don't have a technical basis for policy, don't run around making decisions on the basis of newspaper headlines." After the meeting, Riley caught up to a staff member in the hallway. She was shaken. "Don't take it personally," Riley told her. "Sununu might have been looking at you, but that was directed at me." Don't say the word climate change. By God. Relations between Sununu and Riley became openly adversarial. Riley, Sununu thought, was a creature of the environmental lobby. He was trying to impress his friends at the EPA without having a basic grasp of the science himself. Most unforgivable of all was that what Sununu saw as Riley's propensity to leak to the press. Whenever Riley sent the White House names of candidates he wanted to hire for openings at the EPA, Sununu vetoed them. When it came time for a high-level diplomatic meeting in November, a gathering of environmental ministers in the Netherlands, Sununu didn't trust Riley to negotiate on behalf of the White House. So he sent Allen Bromley to accompany him. Riley, for his part, didn't entirely blame Sununu for Bush's indecision on the prospect of a climate treaty. The president had never taken a vigorous interest in global warming and was mainly briefed about it by non-scientists. Bush had brought up the subject on his campaign trail in his speech about the White House effect after leafing through a briefing booklet for a new issue that might generate some positive press. When Riley tried in person to persuade him to take action, Bush deferred to Sununu and Baker. "Why don't the three of you work it out?" he said. "Let me know when you decide." By the time Riley got to the Nordwijk Ministerial Conference in the Netherlands, he suspected that it was already too late. 11. The Skunks at the Garden Party, November 1989. Rafe Pomerantz awoke at sunlight and stole out of his hotel, making for the flagpoles. It was nearly freezing. November 6, 1989, on the coast of the North Sea in the Dutch resort of Nordwijk. But the wind had yet to rise and the photographer was waiting. More than 60 flags lined the strand between the hotel and the beach, one for each nation in attendance at the first major diplomatic meeting on global warming. The delegations would review the progress made by the IPCC and decide whether to endorse a framework for a global treaty. There was a general sense among the delegates that they would, at minimum, agree to a target proposed by the host, the Dutch environmental minister, more modest than the Toronto number. A freezing of greenhouse gas emissions at 1990 levels by 2000. Some believed that if the meeting was a success, it would encourage the IPCC to accelerate its negotiations and reach a decision about a treaty sooner. But at the very least, the world's environmental ministers should sign a statement endorsing a hard, binding target of emissions reductions. The mood among the delegates was electric, nearly giddy. After more than a decade of fruitless international meetings, they could finally sign an agreement that meant something. Pomerantz had not been among the 400 delegates invited to Nordwijk. But together with three young activists, Daniel Becker of the Sierra Club, Alden Meyer of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Stuart Boyle from Friends of the Earth, he had formed his own impromptu delegation. Their constituency, they like to say, was the climate itself. Their mission was to pressure the delegates to include in the final conference statement, which would be used as a basis for a global treaty, the target proposed in Toronto, a 20% reduction of greenhouse gas combustion by 2005. It was the only measure that mattered. The amount of emissions reductions and the Toronto number was the strongest global target yet proposed. The activists booked their own travel and doubled up in rooms at a beat-up motel down the beach. They managed to secure all access credentials from the Dutch Environmental Ministry's press secretary. He was inclined to be sympathetic toward the activists because it had been rumored that Alan Bromley, one of the United States' lead delegates, would try to persuade the delegates from Japan and the Soviet Union to join him in resisting the idea of a binding agreement. Despite the fact that Bush had again claimed just earlier that week that the United States would play a leadership role in global warming. The Dutch were especially concerned about this development, even a minor rise in sea level would swamp much of their nation. The activists planned to stage a stunt each day to embarrass Bromley and galvanize support for a hard treaty. The first take took place at the flagpoles, where they met a photographer from Agence France Presse at dawn. Or agency, I don't know. Performing for the photographer, Boyle and Becker lowered the Japanese, Soviet, and American flags to half-staff. Becker gave a reporter an outrage statement accusing the three nations of conspiring to block the one action necessary to save the planet. The article appeared on the front pages across Europe. On the second day, Pomerantz and Becker met an official from Kiribati, an island nation of 33 atolls in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. They asked if he was Kiribati's environmental minister. Kiribati is a very small place, the man said. I do everything. I'm the environmental minister. I'm the science minister. I'm everything. If the sea rises, he said, my entire nation will be underwater. Pomerantz and Becker exchanged a look. If we set up a news conference, Pomerantz asked, will you tell them what you just told us? Within minutes, they had assembled a couple dozen journalists. There is no place on Kiribati taller than my head, began the minister, who seemed barely more than 5 feet tall. So when we talk about 1 foot sea level rise, that means the water is up to my shin. He pointed to his shin. 2 feet high, he said, that's my thigh. He pointed to his thigh. 3 feet high, that's my waist. He pointed to his waist. Am I making myself clear? Pomerantz and Becker were ecstatic. The minister came over to them. Is that what you had in mind, he asked. It was a good start and necessary too. Pomerantz had the sinking feeling that the momentum of the previous year was beginning to flag. The censoring of Hansen's testimony and the inexplicably strident opposition from John Sununu were ominous signs. So were the findings of a report Pomerantz had commissioned, published in September by the World Resources Institute, tracking global greenhouse gas emissions. The United States was the largest contributor by far, producing nearly a quarter of the world's carbon emissions, and its contribution was growing faster than that of every country. Bush's indecision, or perhaps inattention, had already managed to delay the negotiation of a global climate treaty until 1990 at the earliest, perhaps even 1991. By then, Pomerantz worried it would be too late. The one meeting to which Pomerantz's atmospheric delegation could not gain admittance was the only one that mattered, the final negotiation. The scientists and IPCC staff members were asked to leave. Just the environmental ministers remained. Pomerantz and the other activists haunted the carpeted hallway outside the conference room, waiting and thinking. A decade earlier, Pomerantz helped warn the White House of the dangers posed by the fossil fuel combustion. 9 years earlier, at a fairy tale castle in the Gulf of Mexico, he tried to persuade Congress to write climate legislation, reshape American energy policy, and demand that the United States lead an international process to arrest climate change. Just 1 year ago, he devised the first emissions target to be proposed at a major international conference. Now, at the end of the decade, senior diplomats from all over the world were debating the merits of a binding climate treaty. Only he was powerless to participate. He could only trust, as he stared at the wall separating him from the diplomats in their muffled debate, that all his work had been enough. The meeting began in the morning and continued into the night, much longer than expected. Most of the delegates had come to the conference ready to sign the Dutch proposal. Each time the doors opened and a minister headed to the bathroom at the other end of the hall, the activists leapt up, asking for an update. The ministers maintained a studied silence, but as the negotiations went past midnight, their aggravation was recorded in their stricken faces and opened collars. What's happening? Becker shouted for the 100th time as the Swedish minister surfaced. Your government, the minister said, is fucking this up. When the beaten delegates finally emerged from the conference room, Becker and Pomerantz learned what happened. Bromley, at the urging of John Sununu, with the acquiescence of Britain, Japan, and the Soviet Union, had forced the conference to abandon the commitment to freeze emissions. The final statement noted that only that many nations supported stabilizing emissions, but did not indicate which nations or what emissions level. And with that, a decade of excruciating, painful, exhilarating progress turned to air. The environmentalists spent the morning giving interviews and writing news releases. You must conclude the conference is a failure, Becker said, calling the dissenting nations the skunks at the garden party. Greenpeace called it a disaster. Timothy Worth in Washington said the outcome was proof that the United States was not a leader, but a delinquent partner. Pomerantz tried to be more diplomatic. The president made a commitment to the American people to deal with global warming, he told the Washington Post, and he hasn't followed it up. He didn't want to sound defeated. There are some good building blocks here, Pomerantz said, and he meant it. The Montreal Protocol on CFCs wasn't perfect at first either. It had huge loopholes and weak restrictions. Once in place, however, the restrictions could be tightened. Perhaps the same could happen with climate change, perhaps. Pomerantz was not one for pessimism. As William Riley told reporters dutifully defending the official position forced upon him, it was the first time the United States had formally endorsed the concept of an emissions limit. Pomerantz wanted to believe that this was progress. Before leaving the Netherlands, he joined the other activists for a final round of drinks and commiseration. He would have to return to Washington the next day and start all over again. The IPCC's next policy group meeting would take place in Edinburgh in 2 months, and there was concern that the Nordwick failure might influence the group members into lowering their expectations for a treaty. But Pomerantz refused to be dejected. There was no point to it. His companions, though more openly disappointed, shared his determination. One of them, Daniel Becker, had just found out that his wife was pregnant with their first child. She had traveled with Becker to the Netherlands to visit friends before the conference started. One day, their host took them on a trip to Zeeland, a southwestern province where 3 rivers emptied into the sea. All week in Nordwick, Becker couldn't stop talking about what he had seen in Zeeland. After a flood in 1953, when the sea swallowed much of the region, killing more than 2,000 people, the Dutch began to build the Delta Works, a vast concrete and steel fortress of movable barriers, dams, and sluice gates, a masterpiece of human engineering. The whole system could be locked into place within 90 minutes, defending the land against storm surge. It reduced the country's exposure to the sea by 700 kilometers, Becker explained. The United States coastline was about 153,000 kilometers long. How long, he asked, was the entire terrestrial coastline? Because the whole world was going to need this. In Zeeland, he said, he had seen the future. Epilogue. Ken Caldera, a climate scientist at the Carnegie Institute for Science in Stanford, California, has a habit of asking new graduate students to name the largest fundamental breakthrough in climate physics since 1979. It's a trick question. There has been no breakthrough. As with any mature scientific discipline, there is only refinement. The computer models grow more precise. The regional analysis sharpen. Estimates solidify into observational data. Where there had been inaccuracies, they had tended to be in the direction of understatement. Caldera and a colleague recently published a paper in Nature finding that the world is warming more quickly than most climate models predict. The toughest emission reductions now being proposed, even by the most committed nations, will probably fail to achieve any given global temperature stabilization target. More carbon had been released into the atmosphere since the final day of the Nordwick Conference, November 7th, 1989, than in the entire history of civilization preceding it. In 1990, humankind burned more than 20 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. By 2017, the figure had risen to 32.5 billion metric tons, a record. Despite every action taken since the Charney Report, the billions of dollars invested in research, the non-binding treaties, the investments in renewable energy, the only number that counts, the total quantity of global greenhouse gas emitted per year, has continued its inexorable rise. Like the scientific story, the political story hasn't changed greatly, except in its particulars. Even some of the nations that pushed hardest for climate policy have failed to honor their own commitments. When it comes to our own nation, which has failed to make any binding commitments whatsoever. The dominant narrative for the last quarter century has concerned the efforts of the fossil fuel industries to suppress science, confuse public knowledge, and bribe politicians. The mustache-twirling depravity of these campaigns has left the impression that the oil and gas industry always operated thus. While the Exxon scientists and American Petroleum Institute clerics of the 70s and 80s were hardly good Samaritans, they did not start multi-million-dollar disinformation campaigns, pay scientists to distort the truth, or try to brainwash children in elementary schools as their successors would. It was James Hansen's testimony before Congress in 1988 that, for the first time since the Changing Climate Report, made oil and gas executives begin to consider the issue's potential to hurt their profits. Exxon, as ever, led the field. 6 weeks after Hansen's testimony, Exxon's manager of science and strategy development, Duane Levine, prepared an internal strategy paper urging the company to emphasize the uncertainty in scientific conclusions. And perhaps they had a little talk with John Sununu. This shortly became the default position of the entire sector. Levine, it so happened, served as the chairman of the Global Petroleum Industries Working Group on Global Climate Change, created the same year, which adapted Exxon's position as its own. The American Petroleum Institute, after holding a series of internal briefings on the subject in the fall and winter of 1988, including one for the chief executives of the dozen or so largest oil companies, took a similar, if slightly more diplomatic, line. It set aside money for carbon dioxide policy, about $100,000, a fraction of the millions it was spending on the health effects of benzene, but enough to establish a lobbying organization called, in an admirable flourish of newspeak, the Global Climate Coalition. It was joined by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and 14 other trade associations, including those representing the coal, electric grid, and automobile industries. The GCC was conceived as a reactive body to share news of any proposed regulations, but on a whim, it added a press campaign to be coordinated mainly by the API. It gave briefings to politicians known to be friendly to the industry and approached scientists who professed skepticism about global warming. The API's payment for an original op-ed was $2,000. The chance to enact meaningful measures to prevent climate change was vanishing, but the industry had just begun. In October 1989, scientists allied with the GCC began to be quoted in national publications, giving an issue that lacked controversy a convenient fulcrum. Many respected scientists said that the available evidence doesn't warrant the doomsday warnings, was the caveat that began to appear in articles on climate change. Cheap and useful, GCC-like groups started to proliferate, but it was not until international negotiations in preparation for the 1992 Rio Earth Summit began that investments in persuasion peddling rose to the level of a line item. At Rio, George H.W. Bush refused to commit to specific emissions reductions. The following year, when President Bill Clinton proposed an energy tax in the hope of meeting the goals of the Rio Treaty, the API invested $1.8 million in a GCC disinformation campaign. Senate Democrats from oil and coal states joined Republicans to defeat the tax proposal. Yay, Democrats. Which later contributed to the Republicans' rout of Democrats in the midterm congressional elections in 1994. The first time the Republican Party had won control of both houses in 40 years. The GCC spent $13 million on a single ad campaign intended to weaken support for the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, which committed to its parties to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 5% relative to 1990 levels. The Senate, which would have had to ratify the agreement, took a preemptive vote declaring its opposition. The resolution passed 95-0. There has never been another serious effort to negotiate a binding global climate treaty. The GCC disbanded in 2002 after the defection of various members who were embarrassed by its tactics. But Exxon, now ExxonMobil, continued its disinformation campaign for another half decade. This has made the corporation an especially vulnerable target for the wave of compensatory litigation that began in earnest in the last 3 years and may last a generation. Tort lawsuits have become possible only in recent years, as scientists have begun more precisely to attribute regional effects on global emission levels. This is one subfield of climate science that has advanced significantly since 1979, the assignment of blame. A major lawsuit has targeted the federal government. a consortium of 21 American children and young adults, one of whom, Sophie Kivlahan of Allentown, PA, is Jim Hansen's granddaughter. Claims that the government, by creating a national energy system that causes climate change, has violated its duty to protect the natural resources to which all Americans are entitled. In 2015, after reports by the website Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times documented the climate studies performed by Exxon for decades, the Attorneys General of Massachusetts and New York began fraud investigations. The Securities and Exchange Commission separately started to investigate whether ExxonMobil's valuation depended on the burning of all of its known oil and gas reserves. ExxonMobil has denied any wrongdoing and stands by its valuation method. The rallying cry of this multi-pronged legal effort is Exxon knew. It is incontrovertibly true that senior employees at the company that would later become Exxon, like those at most other major oil and gas corporations, knew about the dangers of climate change as early as the 1950s. But the automobile industry knew too and began conducting its own research by the early 1980s, as did the major trade groups representing the electrical grid. They all own responsibility for our current paralysis and have made it more painful than necessary, but they haven't done it alone. The United States government knew. Roger Revelle began serving as the Kennedy administration advisor in 1961, 5 years after establishing the Mauna Loa carbon dioxide program, and every president since has debated the merits of acting on climate policy. Carter had the Charney Report, Reagan had Changing Climate, and Bush had the censored testimony of James Hansen and his own public vow to solve the problem. Congress has been holding hearings for 40 years. The intelligence community has been tracking the crisis even longer. Everybody knew. In 1958, on primetime television, the Bell Science Hour, one of the most popular educational film series in American history, aired The Unchained Goddess, a film about meteorological wonders produced by Frank Capra, a dozen years removed from It's a Wonderful Life, warning that man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the release of carbon dioxide. A few degrees rise in the Earth's temperature would melt the polar ice caps, says the film's kindly host, the bespectacled Dr. Research. An inland sea would fill a good portion of the Mississippi Valley. Tourists in glass-bottom boats would be viewing the drowned towers of Miami through 150 feet of tropical water. Capra's film was shown in science classes for decades. Everyone knew, and we all still know. We know that the transformations of our planet, which will come gradually and suddenly, will reconfigure the political world order. We know that if we don't act to reduce emissions, we risk the collapse of civilization. We also know that without a gargantuan intervention, whatever happens will be the worse for our children, worse yet for their children, and even worse still for their children's children, whose lives our actions have demonstrated mean nothing to us. Could it have been any other way? In the late 1970s, a small group of philosophers, economists, and political scientists began to debate, largely among themselves, whether a human solution to this human problem was even possible. They did not trouble themselves about the details of warming, taking the worst-case scenario as a given. They asked instead whether humankind, when presented with this particular existential crisis, was willing to prevent it. We worry about the future, but how much exactly? The answer, as any economist could tell you, is very little. Economics, the science of assigning value to human behavior, prices the future at a discount. The farther out you project, the cheaper the consequences. This makes the climate problem the perfect economic disaster. The Yale economist William D. Nordhaus, a member of Jimmy Carter's Council of Economic Advisors, argued in the 1970s that the most appropriate remedy was global carbon tax, but that required an international agreement, which Nordhaus didn't think was likely. Michael Glantz, a political scientist who was at the National Center for Atmospheric Research at the time, argued in 1979 that democratic societies are constitutionally incapable of dealing with climate problem. The competition for resources means that no single crisis can ever command the public interest for long, yet climate change requires sustained, disciplined efforts over decades. That's why, interjecting, China is way better, is going to be way more adept at combating climate change than any democratic society. And the German physicist, philosopher Klaus Meyer-Abbeck argued that any global agreement would inevitably favor the most minimal action. Adaptation, Meyer-Abbott concluded, seems to be the most rational political option. It is the option that we have pursued, consciously or not, ever since. These theories share a common principle that human beings, whether in global organizations, democracies, industries, political parties, or as individuals, are incapable of sacrificing present convenience to forestall a penalty imposed on future generations. When I asked John Sununu about his part in this history, whether he considered himself personally responsible for killing the best chance at an effective global warming treaty, his response echoed Meyer-Abbott. It couldn't have happened, he told me, because frankly, the leaders in the world at that time were at a stage where they were all looking how to seem like they were supporting the policy without having to make hard commitments that would cost their nation serious resources. He added, frankly, that's about where we are today. If human beings really were able to take the long view, to consider seriously the fate of civilization decades or centuries after our deaths, we would be forced to grapple with the transience of all we know and love in the great sweep of time. So we have trained ourselves, whether culturally or evolutionarily, to obsess over the present, worry about the medium term, and cast the long term out of our minds as we might spit out a poison. Like most human questions, the carbon dioxide question will come down to fear. At some point, the fears of young people will overwhelm the fears of the old. Sometime after that, the young will amass enough power to act. It will be too late to avoid some catastrophes, but perhaps not others. Humankind is nothing if not optimistic, even to the point of blindness. We are also an adaptable species. That will help. The distant perils of climate change are no longer very distant, however. Many have already begun to occur. We are capable of good works, altruism, and wisdom, and a growing number of people have devoted their lives to helping civilization avoid the worst. We have a solution in hand: carbon taxes, increased investment in renewable and nuclear energy, and decarbonization technology. As Jim Hansen told me, from a technology and economic standpoint, it is still readily possible to stay under 2 degrees Celsius. We can trust the technology and the economics. It's harder to trust human nature. Keeping the planet to 2 degrees of warming, let alone 1.5 degrees, would require transformative action. It will take more than good works and voluntary commitments. It will take a revolution. But in order to become revolutionary, you need first to suffer. Hansen's most recent paper, published last year, announced that Earth is now as warm as it was before the last ice age, 115,000 years ago, when the seas were more than 6 meters higher than they are today. He and his team have concluded that the only way to avoid dangerous levels of warming is to bend the emissions arc below the x-axis. We must, in other words, find our way to negative emissions, extracting more carbon dioxide from the air than we contribute to it. If emissions by miracle do rapidly decline, most of the necessary carbon absorption could be handled by replanting forests and improving agricultural practices. If not, massive technological CO2 extraction, using some combination of technologies as yet unperfected or uninvented, will be required. Hansen estimates that this will incur costs of $89 trillion or to $535 trillion this century, and may even be impossible at the necessary scale. He is not optimistic. Like Hansen, Rafe Pomerantz is close to his granddaughter. When he feels low, he wears a bracelet she made for him. He finds it difficult to explain the future to her. During the Clinton administration, Pomerantz worked on environmental issues for the State Department. He is now a consultant for Rethink Energy Florida, which hopes to alert the state to the threat of rising seas, and the chairman of Arctic 21, a network of scientists and research organizations that hope to communicate the ongoing unraveling of the Arctic. Every 2 months, he has lunch with fellow veterans of the climate wars, EPA officials, congressional staff members, and colleagues from the World Resources Institute. They bemoan the lost opportunities, the false starts, the strategic blunders. But they also remember their achievements. In a single decade, they turned a crisis that was studied by no more than several dozen scientists into the subject of Senate hearings, front-page headlines, and the largest diplomatic negotiation in world history. They helped summon into being the world's climate watchdog, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and initiated the negotiations for a treaty signed by nearly all of the world's nations. It is true that much of the damage that might have been avoided is now inevitable, and Pomerantz is not the romantic he once was. but he still believes that it might not be too late to preserve some semblance of the world as we know it. Human nature has brought us to this place. Perhaps human nature will one day bring us through. Rational argument has failed in a rout. Let irrational optimism have a turn. It is also human nature, after all, to hope. And that, my friends, is the end of that. Very long, very expansive article, Losing Earth, the decade we almost stopped climate change. I hope you all enjoyed that. I hope you all enjoyed my reading of that, however jagged it may have been. I'm just reading along and doing my best to convey this information. Who knows what the future brings? We all have our thoughts and our opinions on that. But you know, really, anything can happen. There are likelihoods. There are, you know, there are consensuses on where we're going and how quickly it's happening. But never say never. You never know. Let us continue at least to talk about this and to alert people to what the actual reality of this is. I think that's probably more important than anything, because you can't know where you're going or decide where you're going if you don't even know where you are, if you don't even have a proper map. So let's just continue to map what is going on and try to get clarity on this as best we can. That's all I have for you tonight. Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. Hope to be back tomorrow with another video. Until next time, peace.